let's just get started with questions. We're going to go first to a remote question from one of our remote locations, and those of you who are here in Camden, go ahead and signal to one of the mic runners. Okay, so Jeff Thaler from Yarmouth, Maine, who's in Portland right now, says, how could China's judicial system better enforce environmental laws? Majun.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. I think it's extremely important. You know, I mentioned about the judicial system, you know, in China. Here, I learned from my fellowship at Yale that 80% of the environmental issues are almost like being dealt with at court. But in China, for a long, long time, the judicial system would not function like that, because they are also, our court is also somewhat subordinate to local government. If they don't want to change, want to protect some of the polluting factories, it's quite difficult for the court to do something. That has been, in some way, been changed finally with our new environmental protection law in the year 2015. And at that time, the new law gives the groups, including us, the environmental groups, a standing to file public interest litigation. So there's certain limits there, but in theory, you know, we can go to the court to file litigation.
Have you learned anything from the labor movement in China? Because there are other labor activists and lawyers who sort of predated your movement, who really tried to you know, advocate for China's laborers through the courts. Did any of their experience inform your experience?
Yeah, definitely. We learned from other, you know, colleagues from other civil society groups, and I would say on the environment side, with that new law, we have our partner groups like Friends of Nature, like the CLAP V, you know, led by Professor Wang Canfa. They all very much now focused on the public interest litigation part. And they managed to, through their efforts, to really get quite a number of major cases handled. And in most cases, eventually, those who undermine the ecosystem or causing pollution eventually, you know, settled. Through settlement, you know, instead of final verdict, but they bow to the court, and our role, you know, is sort of we play our role by providing the data to our partners, like Friend of Nature. We have a strategic, we have an agreement, and basically we will send them down all this data we compiled, helping them to identify who should be the primary target for litigation. And also, I'm glad to say that some of our data have been accepted by the court as evidence. And now, you know, there's some sort of a new involvement when now the trend is for the government to push for our prosecutors, our national prosecutors or state prosecutors, or we call procuratorate, to give them the right to sue those polluting factories.
Interesting.
So this, of course, to the civil society, it also may taken some sort of space may take some space away from our NGO partners. So it's quite a dynamic situation.
But if the government is prosecuting, then that's only to the good. All right, we have a question up here in the balcony. Remember to state your name, your town, and if you're a student, where you're from.
Hi, my name is Jake Alieve. I'm a student at the University of Maine at Orono, and I'd just like to say I'm very grateful for all the speakers being here and that we could all share our collective knowledge together this weekend. I found this an amazing time, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
From 2000 to 2011, coal consumption more than tripled in China. China's involved in 240 plus coal projects in the Belt and Road countries, and we recently have seen more environmental initiatives from China that have been mostly domestic. But are these efforts similar to putting a Band-Aid on a laceration? And to add, can the world ever meet the Paris Agreement with China's coal consumption and investments?
Great question. I think that's
Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, the coal consumption have tripled, but ever since the year 2013, after China initiated the national action plan on clean air, our coal consumption mostly got stagnated. And actually, in most of them, decreased to some extent. But I mean, as I mentioned last year, finally we saw some slightly significant rebound, and we have to be quite vigilant on that. And I think, by far, we consume half of the world's coal. If we can do more in China, I think it will be good, not just for China. This is a major source of local pollution, but also global climate change, greenhouse gas emission. So if we can do more in China, that will be very, very helpful. Having said that, the Belt and Road project, we heard about increasing concerns over some of the projects there. And when it comes to coal thing, I mean, now I think that the Chinese government point of view is that it's not up to us to decide whether those countries, Belt and Road countries, want to build a coal power or a solar power, renewable. Of course, the Western will is that you give money, you give support to make it happen. So you still have a role to play. In some way, I quite agree with that. I think Belt and Road, recently I've been invited to give a talk at the AIIB, and I mentioned about the possibility for us to come together to tap into the vast increase of environmental transparency in China, to build a database on Belt and Road. Wherever the companies or investors from China are going, we need to find a way to track them down, keep their records, and if people can, if some of them are serial polluters in China, violators in China, then I hope the Belt and Road countries could keep be careful with them. And of course, we want the feedback from those countries about their operation outside China. I hope those data could be fed back into China. So with this, can set up a system to keep them down.
I know Liz wanted to add something, and I'm going to urge all of our speakers to be brief because we have limited time before the break.
Right. I think it is a huge challenge. It's not just the export of the coal-fired power plants, but also, there's steel, there's cement industries. Many of China's most polluting industries are now being exported abroad. So I think the Belt and Road, in terms of its impact on pollution in many of these countries, has quite a negative impact. I will say this is not necessarily something new, because China has, since 1997-98, had a go-out strategy, right, where it has, undertaken many, and its Resource Quest has done a lot of infrastructure development, and it has always operated under its own sort of environmental, labor, and transparency standards. The question is why, after so many years, it hasn't improved, right? It's not simply Belt and Road in the past, 4 or 5 years. It's decades now of these kinds of standards. And look, the United States passed a law under the Obama administration where it said that overseas development financing could not go for coal-fired power plants. That is something that China could also do. That is one way that China could exert a very positive influence through its Belt and Road project on the development of the sort of energy resources of other countries. And given China's extraordinary development of renewables, right, from wind to solar to hydro, one would think it could do a better job, right? In Kenya, for example, got its first coal-fired power plant as a result of Belt and Road in an environmentally sensitive area, which I'm sure you know. So I would just say, I think there's plenty of room for China to do better on this front.
All right, great. Let's keep the questions brief and the answers brief so more people can get in.
I'm Adria Bates from Darien, Connecticut. And my question is sort of impossible to answer, I guess. It's nice to think of the water theory, and nothing in life is really permanent. But how much damage is being done right now by our lovely country is this permanent? Are there other mechanisms in place? Maybe the rest of the world should just fix everything, because I'm not sure that we're really doing a great job
Are
right
you
now.
referring to climate change?
No, in the, getting together of the countries, in the relations and the ultimate relations of U.S. and China to
Okay,
lead
Robert,
the
do you want
world.
to start on that?
Well, as I said, we're certainly bleeding soft power, credibility and buy-in globally. But there has also, a little less recently, still been a demand for American involvement and a wish for the reassertion of American values that we had been in the business of asserting as a matter of self-interest since World War II. Some nations, Germany, the EU, seem to be in stages giving up on that. But I also think we've got a lot of money in the bank. And it depends in part on how long this goes on. I don't want to get into domestic politics here. Both the United States and China, one of the things we have in common is the two governments give a lot of lip service to the importance of multilateralism, global institutions. We give lip service. But the United States and China, for related but different reasons, neither of us is willing to sacrifice an iota of what we call our sovereignty to further empower those organizations. And that was true before before Xi Jinping and before Donald Trump. So as I say, we have two very self-regarding nations that are both in different ways obstacles to multilateralism. It's already been mentioned that we should have a different governance structure in things like the World Bank. But China has also opposed the inclusion of, say, India and Japan in the Security Council at the UN. So there's a lot of this to go around. It's a problem for both nations.
All right, we've got a question here.
Reuben Brown from Rockport. The last time I dealt with China on coal use in residential situations was 30 years ago. People were just beginning to look at modern, efficient stoves. Can you tell us if innovations in the residential coal consumption that you identified as 13% of coal consumption has proceeded? And whether or not that's an area where certainly we can get the particulates cut down close to home. That's just a question.
Okay, Majun.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, definitely residential use is still important. Although in China, 80% of our power electricity is consumed by the industrial process. That's a very, very different from any developed Western countries. Having said that, the residential use is still quite important because those use often lead to some discharge without much emission control at all. So we still need to manage that. And during the past 2-3 years, the central government has been pushing for cities, including Beijing, and now a vast, a large number of them, to have the residents switch from coal power to coal power to natural gas and to electricity. And a huge subsidy have been given to residents in Beijing, so making that relatively more successful, and also to ensure the natural gas supply there, it's relatively successful. But in the surrounding regions, it's a different story. When even the major steel plant is trying to have themselves powered by natural gas, because they don't want to cut back their production, but they want to stick to so that take away the residential use supply. So causing a lot of social problems. So now, this year, that policy have been no longer, enforced that steadily. So having said that, I think there's a lot of room for conservation, better insulation, better stoves, as you mentioned, more innovative way of stoves, and also even on management. If we can have each resident to have some sort of their own way to control the temperature, room temperature. It's wholly possible. There's rules for new buildings all to install that. Unfortunately, simply just like many other rules, they're not quite enforced. So I think that those are the issues that we should continue to work on.
All right, we're going to take a final lightning round here. We have a question from a remote location. Where does China stand on the value and implementation of a carbon tax? Okay, so remember that carbon tax question. All right, and then we had someone up here who had a question.
Craig Mudge from Camden, Maine. In the wake of the one-child policy, could I hear any comments that could be offered with respect to what the citizens' view is and the government's view of the success and impact of the one-child policy?
Okay, one-child policy. Do we have any more remote questions? Okay, so we'll go to a question here.
Hi, Charlie Graham from Camden. Going to Robert's final remarks about the lack of ideas coming in this country for how to moderate our relationship with China on the world stage. Do you see any sources of such moderating opinion in this country that we should be encouraging?
Thank you. All right, so lightning round. Ma-Jun, first you on carbon tax. Liz, if you can take the one-child policy question, and Robert on voices of moderation.
Yeah, when it comes to carbon tax, there has been studying and debate and discussion on that, but China is opting for another alternative, that is the cap and treat carbon market. And so that has been established as the major way to try to deal with the reduction of carbon. Having said that, I think our carbon market have been planning have been very much downsized, with the obvious reason that the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement by the United States have taken away the international pressure, which used to be initiated very much during the Obama administration, but then now suddenly it's gone. The global solidarity have been very much impacted, and in China there are those who are not that enthusiastic, so that's a good excuse.
They can blame the U.S. easily.
They can blame easily, so that one is not quite moving forward, and we as an NGO also believe that it's not quite the conditions still not quite mature for that market to be really launched, because so far we still haven't seen the disclosure of the carbon the emission by the individual facilities. We all know, cap and treat. If you don't have the data disclosure, then no one gonna know what you are treating, and eventually that won't lead to you're gonna have treat, but it may not lead to real emission reduction. So we continue to push for that disclosure. So far, we have some success made with some of the major global brands, who are doing something highly innovative. For example, Apple have been doing an analysis on its carbon footprint of iPhone and found that 1/4 of that comes from the aluminum manufacturers in China. So recently they made a decision to stop any of them from using any coal power. That is a drop of 1/4 of the carbon footprint of all these iPhones that you're using, and they're also motivating all their factories, big factories like Foxconn, to install the solar panels on the rooftop. I think all of this are extremely important because Paris Agreement is not like Kyoto Protocol. It's not legally binding. It's up to the stakeholders, especially the big business to take action. So we all need to pay, I hope we all pay attention to that and give them motivation to do more.
Liz?
So on the one-child policy over the past couple of years, it's been sort of abolished basically in stages so that now you can have 2 children. I think one of the things that has been surprising to many people is that in fact it has not produced a significant increase in the number of children born in China. In fact, this year the number of children born was the lowest since 1961. So it's been extraordinary. And why, you might ask, I think there are a number of different reasons that play into this. Some of this has to do with just the expense of raising children in China. It's expensive to send your child to school. There are people that are concerned about issues like pollution. Actually, birth rates tend to correlate fairly closely with economic growth and optimism. And some of the statistics coming out in China on the growth rate, 1.67%. One Chinese economist reported that that's what an internal government study said. So there's a sense maybe that things are not moving in the right direction, and that breeds some pessimism. And then maybe there's an element of the feminist movement, which is really developing the Me Too movement very strongly in China. And part of the message coming out is you do not have to have children. That's one other point, is that actually in jobs, and there's been some good media reporting on this in China, and some of these tech companies, they're very bad about women and having children, and you lose your job or you get your pay cut. So there's discrimination against women for having children. So I think there are a number of different factors that probably play into this. I haven't seen one definitive study of it, but it has not had the impact that people anticipated. So the demographic trends in China continue to deteriorate. If I can make one other just point, and I think when we're talking about the U.S.-China relationship, it is important for the U.S. to come up with ideas for cooperation. But if you look back traditionally, over the course of the past few decades, it's almost always the United States who has the ideas for cooperation. It's almost always the U.S. who reaches across to China to say, let's do something on climate change, right? This is a moment in time. We have Xi Jinping, very ambitious, standing up at Davos saying China's going to be a leader on globalization, talking about China as a leader of climate change. We will still, do our job on climate change, notwithstanding the U.S. position. So I think this is a time when we could reasonably look to China as well, maybe to step up and say, hey, the global refugee problem, that's a huge issue. Why not partner on that? Both countries are bad, actually, on that issue. But there are other things, artificial intelligence. There are many other areas that are ripe for cooperation, that are important as we look ahead. So I think while we suffer at this moment, I think in Washington, that's not the orientation of most of the people. We're more focused on dealing with the challenge that we perceive China presents. I do think that fourth C of cooperation has to be there to keep the relationship from fraying, but it's incumbent on both countries, to figure that out. And very last point I'm going to make, since I had this little moment, I think one thing that we've missed here, generally speaking, is that this is not just the United States and China. It's not just the United States.
You're stealing my point on the answer.
Sorry, dude. But I've been waiting a long time for this. Sorry.
Well, listen now.
Okay.
Wait. This is my key point.
All
this is
right. Really?
No,
I can't say this?
This is part of the answer on forces for moderation and normalization of competition. There are a couple. One is constituencies within the U.S.
Seriously?
Yes.
Wait. That's mansplaining.
Let's let Liz finish her point.
Kind of it is.
Okay,
dude.
Robert, let's wait and let Liz finish her point, and then we'll come to your question.
You can be additive to this point, which is, because I think it'll be slightly different, which is to say, because I see where you're going, I think it's going to be slightly different. And that is
we have
to say
mansplaining,
that
we have female telepathy, which is good.
Let's see who wins. Okay. So I think
it's not a competition.
Point,
Everyone's going to make their point.
We're actually good friends. My point here is really that it's not about just the rest of the world looking at the U.S. and thinking, we've moved off the reservation with this particular administration and we're out of bounds. It's also about the rest of the world looking at China, right? So there's a sense, it's not just the United States that's talking about Made in China 2025, that's worried about influence operations. These things, in fact, began in other countries, right? Australia was really the canary in the coal mine on influence operations. Germany was upfront on the technology concerns. There are many different countries that are worried both about how the US is behaving, but also about how China is behaving. So I think when we think, we're talking all about the United States and China, but this really is a global sort of set of perspectives and challenges about the nature of this relationship. Now, I know you're going to use it as an opportunity for moderating forces and cooperation, so I set up a different perspective,
I was actually
right?
going to talk about the Duke-Syracuse game.
There you go. All right. So I blew it. Telepathy loses.
Yeah. So, forces for moderation. We do see, I think, voices coming up from various expert communities that are now saying we need a strategy with more narrowly defined, tailored interests to drive us. And I mentioned that we've seen a few studies that are calling for sort of a calming down. So the expert community is one possible source of moderation, although it's also a source of immoderation. Another source of moderation as well as immoderation is within Congress and Washington itself, where there actually are various voices, in part because the strongly anti-Chinese voices have been so loud. Others have been cowed into making a defensive engagement because they're afraid that they'll be accused of being useful idiots at best, if not outright traitors. But those voices are still quite strong, and I wouldn't give up on them yet. We also have national constituencies, local interests at the city, state, county level, which are enormous, people to people, universities, and very importantly, a great many major American corporations, despite the trade frictions, haven't really weighed in on what the results for them, for their shareholders, for their employees would be of global disengagement. And so we're going to see more voices coming to the fore. And then on international, I think that is also a major moderating force. One of the biggest mistakes we make in talking about US-China relations is a tendency to speak as though there are no other countries except the US and China. And when you speak that way, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that we're headed for conflict. But in fact, there are many other countries, and we are involved with them in very complex networks of compromise and mutual interest and cooperation. And I think it's those multinational networks of compromise and cooperation that have a very good chance of saving both the United States and China from their own worst instincts. This doesn't mean we're going to return to the pre-Xi Jinping era. This is going to be more contentious. There's going to be a lot of countering, of calling out. China isn't going to like it. There's a question of whether China can come up with a public framework for competition. We're quite comfortable talking about adversity, not as comfortable talking about compromise. China has a hard time because of its political culture and diplomatic tradition of moving beyond the notion that China has a wholly virtuous, always correct foreign policy, and that everybody would get along if we only understood each other better. One of the reasons that we don't get along, I think, is that we understand each other all too well.
All right. Well, we can all agree on one thing, which is this was a marvelous morning panel and marvelous speeches.